The way that the media referred to this storm was a bomb cyclone, which sounds pretty dramatic.
And the risk often in these extreme weather events is actually on the upside, that you don't communicate effectively the dangers inherent in something like an east coast low, which can bring seriously heavy rain, flash flooding.
One of the most concerning parts about this for me is the campaigns over many years against the bomb, the Bureau of Meteorology in some parts of the media.
Hi, Mike.
Morning, Nour.
Hey, Pat.
Good morning, Nour.
So this week, Australians living on the east coast were warned in no uncertain terms of the damaging and destructive storm coming our way. What are the factors that you consider when commissioning wild weather or extreme weather stories?
Weather stories are often hugely fascinating for our readers and us. And the fascination is really in how dramatic they are. People are very directly affected by extreme weather events in many cases, and that's obviously a huge news story. I guess the problem is what level you pitch that story at when you don't know, or no one knows. Even the Bureau of Meteorology doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. So I guess the answer is we try to rely on reliable sources, the Bureau of Meteorology particularly, although we can come to how they have been drawn into controversy over this a bit later perhaps. And also around the use of language. It's very tempting for news organisations, including us, to use. There are lots of terms that will draw people into a story that we have used and others have used before, like polar blasts, polar vortexes, rain bombs, thunder snow, heat domes, all these kind of things, which are in many cases genuine terms, but are sometimes controversial about whether they should be applied to the exact situation or not. Those are the kind of things we have to consider.
Yeah, just add a couple of things on there. Obviously, we have to be very cautious about the safety of our staff, as well as ensuring that we give accurate advice to readers. We need to do risk assessments when we're sending people out on the ground to do reporting. The other element to it, which is a big thing, and I'm sure we'll come to it later, is about how we relate these extreme weather events to climate change, which is obviously a real concern. We know that increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere also have knock-on effects to weather patterns, increase the amount of moisture in the air. It can also lead to other extreme weather events like heat waves and droughts as well. And that's an ongoing discussion. I think The Guardian is ahead of many other publications on ensuring that we do make references to climate change in our weather reporting. But whether you need to say that every time you write a weather story is an ongoing discussion.
And we will get to that conversation around climate change in a moment, but I want to go back to the point that Mike made around not over-egging a story. The way that the media referred to this storm was a bomb cyclone, which sounds pretty dramatic. Meteorologists and other experts questioned that framing. The Bureau of Meteorology didn't use that term. How important is the language that we use when describing these extreme weather events?
Yeah, it's really important. Firstly, just to be completely clear, there was a previous controversy involving with the bomb, when they asked for that word not to be used as an abbreviation for the Bureau of Meteorology a few years ago. That's not what we're talking about here. They backtracked very quickly because everyone said, this is ridiculous. We're going to keep calling it the bomb whether you like it or not. Anyway.
It does make the whole subject confusing, doesn't it?
It does make it confusing. It does make it confusing. Anyway, this time, the bomb cyclone is a genuine thing. It's an accepted meteorological term. And other media outlets did use this a lot from the start, before the storm hit. We, as usual, went to the Bureau of Meteorology to ask them what they were calling it. There was a bit of confusion there, to be fair. A senior meteorologist said, yes, bombing cyclone is a term, but we prefer not to use it. It's a bit scary. So we generally steered clear of that, but lots of other people did use it. It wasn't necessarily legitimate to use it because there is such a thing. But yeah, it falls into that basket of, are we making this sound more dramatic and more scary than it needs to be?
Bomb's alternative, the Bureau's alternative, is they wanted to use the term vigorous east coast low, which I think also undersells it. And the risk often in these extreme weather events is actually on the upside, that you don't communicate effectively the dangers inherent in something like an east coast low, which can bring seriously heavy rain, flash flooding. So I think there is a kind of question around, yes, it's dramatic, but sometimes to grab people's attention, the drama is warranted in a way.
I noticed the Batuta Advocate satirically described it as a, quote, once in a millennium megadeth cyclone rain bomb.
And look, that is another risk in that if you keep on crying wolf, readers will and audiences will switch off if, every time there's a weather event, we come up with a term saying, a mega death rainstorm. It's, people are going to tune out.
The other part of that is that in terms of how severe it was, is that many of the areas that have been quite badly affected are also still recovering, both from the floods earlier this year on the mid-north coast of New South Wales and even from the bushfires a few years ago down on the south coast. Sometimes that is hard to appreciate in the immediate aftermath when, if we may not be talking about very many deaths or that much damage, it's just like comes on top of all these other previous weather-related disasters or climate-related disasters. So in the sense of trying to express the severity of an event, we need to take those kind of longer-term things into it.
Yeah, and we recently had the New South Wales budget here and Queensland and New South Wales have both been hit very heavily by extreme weather events in recent years, and the state budgets are also being hammered by the repeated cost of these things, of flood recovery, of cyclone recovery. It's a major issue for state governments as well.
As the wind and rain swept through Sydney, The Guardian was also reporting on people dying in heat waves in Europe, and we published a piece saying that drought around the world is pushing tens of millions of people towards starvation. Does the media have a tendency to cover these events as singular, isolated incidents without connecting the dots, without connecting or explaining the way that extreme weather events are connected to climate change?
They definitely do. I mean, it's difficult because you have to cover the news on a day-to-day basis. There are many different kinds of reporting. Like, not every single 500-word news story can go in depth into to what extent that weather event can be related to climate change. But we do have to do that in the round, both in our normal reporting and in a kind of a news reporting and a kind of analysis or comment pieces. Mostly the advice is these kind of events become either more likely or more intense due to climate change. And for that, we can refer obviously to studies that have been done to show that, which we do frequently and as often as possible in relation to daily reporting. In the case of the East Coast low, oddly, it seems like the evidence is more that they are less likely to happen, a bit less frequently as the climate warms, especially in winter, but that when they do happen, they're more intense, especially in summer. So that kind of nuance is difficult to bring in when you're just reporting on what's happening right here, right now.
And I think it requires a level of technical expertise from reporters. And we're lucky in Guardian Australia to have some really good people on our environment and climate team who understand in detail these weather events and how it's related to climate science. But I think for many reporters around Australia that you're just not going to have the level of technical expertise to get into that, as Mike says, in a 500-word story about the weather.
There is some research that's found that media can downplay extreme weather events, particularly heat waves, using imagery of people going to the beach or enjoying slushies and ice creams. How do you sort of reconcile that?
We've changed our practices on that, I think, quite consciously in the last few years. It's kind of the obvious image to reach for when you're trying to illustrate a story about heat. But obviously that is giving a quite different impression to the dangers and the immediately unpleasant effects of heat, which are much harder to illustrate in a very instant way. But we've tried really hard to steer away from that kind of coverage.
I think it has been a challenge for picture editors and news editors to make this change. People do go to the beach on hot days to try and cool down, but for example, heat wave deaths amongst the elderly, the vulnerable are in their own home. And it's much harder to illustrate. So there are challenges, but The Guardian, we're making an attempt to change those. And I think we've been successful for a large part in trying to change the way that we use images with stories about heat waves. But look, it's not, you understand why news editors and photo editors take these kind of decisions.
How much should readers or consumers of news be aware of the way that media coverage of extreme weather events can be shaped or influenced by political agendas? I'm thinking, for example, of the SA blackouts a number of years ago and the way that spurred on a debate around the transition to renewables.
One of the most concerning parts about this for me is the campaigns over many years against the BOM, the Bureau of Meteorology, in some parts of the media, undermining their credibility, both on the way they report their figures in terms of the long-term climate changes. And obviously these are things that can't be predicted with extreme degrees of accuracy. Sometimes there may be valid criticisms of them, but in some certain parts of the News Corp media, there is a kind of long-term, over many years, willingness to cast doubt on the credibility of the Bureau of Meteorology as a credible source of information on climate and weather. And I think that is really dangerous. And like any other organisation, they're subject to valid criticisms. But yeah, I think we don't take an ideological view of whether we assume they're doing science.
Look, weather and climate have been inherently political for a while now, I think. Casting back to when Scott Morrison was in government, there was often, standing up at presses after bushfires or floods, he would get questions about climate. And, there was often this kind of reaction where now is not the time to talk about it, which is what you see after, gun-related deaths in the US. They always say, thoughts and prayers, but we can't talk about gun reform here. It is the time that we need to be talking about climate when we do experience these extreme weather events. Not all of them can be linked to climate, but we know on the basis of science that they are going to get worse and more frequent. It is the time to discuss it. They are linked. And, I just find this reaction where politicians are quite happy to get up and talk about giving communities, support and aid. But when the question of climate comes up, many of them will kind of run scared on it.
Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I think that kind of talk is maybe a little on the wane, and politicians of many parts at least are more willing to refer to climate change when they talk about immediate weather events.
The other thing we see with politicians is they're quite happy to get up there with their rain jackets on and talk about immediate effects of the weather, but where we often don't see them is 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later in those communities, talking about the reconstruction, because I think that's a much more difficult process, and they will encounter a lot more community anger rather than the kind of immediate effects where they're giving updates and so on.
And we are seeing the politicisation of science and scientific institutions play out globally.
We ran a story this week from our climate and environment correspondent, Graham Redfern, who was looking at some Antarctic scientific data about, global warming, global heating. And the scientists who were working on that project said, look, this is the last time we'll do this particular update because the US is going to stop providing the satellite data. Now, in the US, there's this great institution called the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration who have provided data about global heating, about climate change for many decades. But, with the Trump administration's attacks on science and on climate research, that is one of the victims of these cutbacks. But it does show how these kind of political attacks, for instance, on the Bureau of Meteorology, can actually translate. It's not just rhetoric, it can translate into real world effects.
Well, Oscar Wilde once said that conversation about the weather is the last refuge of the unimaginative. So if you've made it this far, well done.
Yeah, I think that covers a very large percentage of the population. happy to be included.
Okay, it is now time for what you can't get out of your head. Mike, what was it for you?
So not for the first time, I want to mention a column by our UK columnist Marina Hyde, which many listeners will be familiar with. She was writing this week about the move to potentially prosecute acts performing at the Glastonbury Festival for things they said on stage, and making the point generally that prosecuting people for things they say is not a great idea. We had a case this week in Australia where the Islamic preacher Wissam Haddad was convicted under the Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act for things that he'd said in a religious context. He wasn't. The sentence was only that he should remove the information from where it had been posted online and pay legal costs. But I think both cases, these cases raise really interesting questions about freedom of speech, how it should be policed, whether it should be policed. Very tricky areas. I thought Marina Hyde's piece said it really well, though.
It is a tricky area. There was an example which has been quite controversial in the UK of a Tory councillor's wife who posted on Facebook basically urging people to set asylum seeker hotels on fire, which, if you're talking about how extreme levels are, that is on the extreme end, excitement to violence. So I think it does reflect that kind of tricky balance where not all kind of speech is at the same level.
And Pat, what was it for you?
I really enjoyed reading a feature by Katie Cunningham that we ran last weekend, and it was talking to young people about mobile phone usage and how they think, many of them think, kind of regret the time they spent on it as young kids and teenagers. And it's really the first generation that's got to sort of the age of like 25 who have been on devices since primary school. And it was interesting hearing from them, many of them sort of regretting losing parts of their childhood. And I think for parents, many people my age, we struggle with this with our own children. And it's a good reminder about these devices have entered our lives, but we don't have to give over everything to them. We are in control and we can, make decisions about how we use them.
Mike, Pat, thanks so much.
Thanks, Nour.
Thanks, Nour.